Niawe scano swaguego, yat e, haum takiapi, anin, buju, shodatsi, dosha, guatsi, hopa, keshi. So just practicing a few of my greetings that I picked up along the way. I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of people out here, and one of them actually was from, he had spent some time out in Western New York, and he said a phrase that was familiar to me, and it's always comforting to hear your own language when you're far away from home, so that's my attempt at bringing some comfort to you guys far away from home. So first of all, I want to take this time to thank you to Jerry, to Ine, to the Indigenous Language Institute, to the Pueblo of Powake for hosting this. It's really an honor to be out here, that somebody has enough faith in me to come up here and present and share what I have learned and the work that I've done over the years. So that was the first thing I wanted to do, was acknowledge that. So zitzawa nikya so ne ongwe onwe ka. Anybody know what that is? So my name is a corn tassel in my language. Damian nikya so ne ganyo onka. Satgad ne Damian the Omen. Damian Marley. Damian from Mean Girls, if some of you watch that. Gistalag onkiasta hawe ne galon dowan. So where Jerry's from, he had mentioned a man yesterday called Sally Hocht. And in the 2 years that I spent out in Oneida, Wisconsin, that's who I learned Oneida from. And I used a lot of his Oneida lessons to help me with my Seneca, because the structures of the language are the same. So I started calling him the Zen master, because he's an older guy and he works out, and he just got this real calmness about him. So as I kept calling him Zen master, he wanted to call me Grasshopper. So they started calling me Gistaluk. So whenever those Oneidas come out our way and I hear Gistaluk, I know exactly who it is calling my name. So Tanamonde Onundawaka Niwago Anzute. So my nation is the Tonawanda Seneca Nation. That's in Western New York, just outside of Buffalo there. So what you see here, that's some of the signs at the edge of our reservation here. And then there's our longhouse. There's an old picture of our longhouse. And then that's the same longhouse just years later. And then here is a gustoet, our head attire that we wear, and that one feather is used to distinguish that we are Seneca. So I'm of the Turtle Clan, and we are a matrilineal society, not matriarchal, matrilineal. The lineage goes through the women. So I get my clan from my mom, she gets her clan, that line follows all the women in our line of our family. So today in the Western world, a lot of times you'll take the last name of your father, but in our society, that lineage follows the mother. So my daughters are Wolf Clan. Whenever they have kids, they're going to be Wolf Clan. So they're not going to follow my clan. They're going to follow their mom's clan and their grandma's clan and so forth. Aweo yenta yeaso ne aknoe. Ne kone Bruce King hayaso ne hagetni. So my mom's name is Aweo yenta in the language. A lot of people know her as Madi. And then my dad's name is Bruce King. So when we moved down here in 1992, he started getting a lot of phone calls from people telling him what kind of policies he should implement as the governor of New Mexico, because that was the name of the governor at the time. His name was also Bruce King. So he had to field a lot of calls and tell them they had the wrong number. John Connor hayaso no ne hagetni oen gaon. Satgad ne John Connor ne Terminator series. So Bruce King is my dad who raised me ever since I was born. And later on in life, I discovered that I had a biological father named John Connor, who is Nimipu, or Nez Perce is what they call it now. So when I saw that picture, I couldn't believe how much I resembled him just the likeness. And I never did get to meet him in person, but we did correspond with letters. And when I did find out about him, and they told me the name John Connor, this is what I was like, John Connor from Terminator? Deknik sa dayen, aguas kenu kwa, Gianna yeyaso ne kone, wakiawi yeyaso. So I have two daughters, Gianna and Wakiawi. Wakia lives out in Sisseton, South Dakota, or Sisituan Wapechtuan, if I said that right. I can't remember if Alex is here to tell me if I said that right. So that's where their grandpa on their mom's side is from, Sisseton. And so Wakia's out there with their mom. Gianna lives with me out there in Western New York. So those are my two daughters, the light of my life. Hanon tauni hanon de esta kwa dwagiot de kwahe jongod niknon gate. So this is where I work, the hanon tauni hanon de esta kwa. So we try to make it easy for the surrounding communities because they have a hard time pronouncing that and reading that. So when we give it out to people, the digestible form of that program is just called Lifeways. But as you can see, they are making a path, and that's related to the word for wolf. The wolf, it has that word about it's making its own path. So that's where I work. I've been working there for about 2 years. We have a pre-K through third grade program. The pre-K comes in the morning, and then in the afternoons, the kindergarten through third graders arrive. We also have an adult language program that we just started in February of 2017, and we're about to add another cohort of year one students. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Tonawanda Seneca Nation. We are independent because I've met people. I've had the pleasure of meeting a lot of really nice people just this week. And there's people who have met people from Seneca Nation, and they remember the casino, and there's a lot of stuff out there that they have. So there's 2 Seneca Nations, and really 3 if we count the Seneca Cayugas down in Oklahoma. So the Seneca Nation of Indians is a different band of Senecas. So they're the ones who have the casinos. There are 2 communities. There's Allegheny and Cattaraugus. So they're a separate community. In the mid-1800s, they adopted the electoral system for their own valid reasons, and they had chief's titles. So their titles Tonawanda ended up taking those titles off the wall because we felt that they were very important. So we had to make a decision if we were going to either stick with our traditional government or go with an elective system. And we decided to stick with our traditional government. So Tonawanda is one of 3 nations in the United States that still maintains its traditional form of government. So if you come to our territory, especially now because it's election time, there are no elections at Tonawanda. We don't have any presidents or governors or chairmen, anything like that. We have a chief's council. There's 8 titles, and those chiefs are selected by the clan mothers, and they're put in for life. But those clan mothers also have the ability to remove that title if they're not working for the people. I'm not saying that our system is perfect, that it's flawless just because we have our traditional system. We deal with all the same problems every other elective system does, but at least we deal with it on our terms. So Tonawanda doesn't take any federal funding. We take no federal funding from the government because we don't want any strings attached. We don't want them to have any say-so in what we do in our business. So we don't take federal funding. There's no HUD housing on there. There's no BIA presence on our reservation. The only thing we have is just off the res line, we have a clinic that we utilize for our health services. So our program is funded entirely by the tribe. And because we're funded by the tribe, it's within the tribe, we don't have to answer to all these agencies as far as timelines, as far as what some of the presenters were talking about as far as assessments go. We dictate how our programs go. We dictate the standards of our programming. And so in that respect, we try to hold ourselves very accountable as well because we're the ones calling the shots, but we also want to have a good program. So that's just a little background on Tonawanda. So I'm just going to give a little background here. So that's a picture of me like 20 years ago. And I met Wes Studi probably when I looked like that. And that's probably why he kind of forgot who I was last night. But I've known Wes since I was 19 years old. And it's funny because he took pictures back there. And I got that big check last night. And I was at that table right where he was taking pictures, and I thought everybody was coming to take pictures with me, but they all are going to take pictures with him. I said, why are they going over there? I got the check over here, So, no, I'm just kidding. But I've known Wes a long time, and it was good to see him again. So that's a picture with my mom, and we've switched. My mom is real skinny now, and I ballooned up a little bit. But this is also a picture of my great-grandma. This is her grandma, Viola Blanche Skye. And my mom tells us that she was the last speaker in our family. She was the last one who spoke the Seneca language in our family, in our line. So when I look at my language, I didn't have people around me. I wasn't blessed in the sense that I had this community around me. We grew up in the city of Buffalo. I was born in Chicago. We lived in Santa Fe here for a little bit before moving to Buffalo. And I grew up in the city. So I didn't grow up around the Longhouse. I didn't grow up around the ceremonies. I didn't have aunts and uncles that spoke the language. I didn't have a mom and dad that spoke the language. I didn't have grandparents that spoke the language. My grandma, my dad's mom, they said she used to speak Oneida when she was little, but she was a part of that relocation program. So she ended up relocating from the Oneida Reservation into the city of Chicago. And when she did that cut her connection to the Oneida language as well. So those are real things that happened, and that definitely affected my family. So by all means, I'm really lucky that somehow, some way, the language found me, because by all rights, I should have never even found my language. Everything that the government wanted us to do to disconnect us and distance us from us, that happened. Our family was a part of that. Language wasn't a priority in our lives. We only knew a couple words here and there, and that's about it. And I literally mean like probably 3 or 4 words in our household. And then I relocated here for my senior year and spent a lot of time down here. And so I'm 2,000 miles away from my culture, removed from it. So in some kind of way, the language did find its way back to me. And we'll talk about that. So this is the journey I took. This is in 1992, we left, moved to Santa Fe. I ended up attending Haskell, and I'll talk about that. Lived in Sisseton, South Dakota for a little bit. Grand Forks, North Dakota. There's some people here who have spent time in Grand Forks, North Dakota. You do not know cold until you live in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And I mean it, like negative 45 wind chills for 2 months straight. It's brutally cold there. That's the coldest place I've ever lived. Oneida, Wisconsin, so where Jerry's from, his home, that's where I spent a couple years. And then I finally moved back to Western New York, and I live in the town of Akron. So I said, Joangud ni Kanongate. So that's what they call Akron, Joangud. Another thing they call it is Heyonge, which is like it's herd over there. So I don't know if they had a mill over there or something, but it was called like it's herd there. Heyonge, but in English they just call it Akron, New York, and it's about 5 or 6 miles away from the res, and then I just drive into work every day. So that's part of my journey. I've been blessed to be in all these communities, and everywhere I went, I found the Native community. So I've been lucky enough to go to different ceremonies, different functions, different clubs, all kinds of extracurricular activities to be around. So I've been to the feast down here. I'm familiar with going to feast day. You can see I have a Santa Fe Indian School shirt on right now. So I worked at Santa Fe Indian School just up the road for 8 years, where we serve a lot of Pueblo, Dene, Apache students. And every now and then we would get students from far away. I would notice them right away because you could tell their last name was different. So we even had people from the Northeast. Their family moved down, they ended up going to Santa Fe Indian School. We had people from the Blackfeet, and we had Lakotas, and we had all kinds of different students that would end up at Santa Fe Indian School as well. So I spent a good amount of time there, and they really reinforced the culture at Santa Fe Indian School. You're free to be who you are. You know, you have a lot of kids in public schools trying to just wear an eagle feather in their cap for graduation. But at SFIS, you'd go to full nine. You put your regalia on, you put your traditional clothes on, and you'd be proud of who you are when it's time to graduate. Okay, so here's our guest from last night. In 1992, I went with my parents to a movie. You guys probably all know that movie. So that was the first time I ever got to see native language featured in a Hollywood production. And a lot of times I grew up, whenever we did go out to the res, they would talk about people speaking Indian. Oh, they're talking Indian. Those guys are talking Indian. She knows how to talk Indian, whatever. So speaking Indian was a term that I just thought was like this. I'm so sheltered in Buffalo, right? I don't know anything. So I'm thinking like, I can't wait till this comes out at Blockbuster Video because I'm gonna go rent it and I'm gonna learn how to speak Indian to my relatives and to the elders. Not knowing that this is actually Lakota language. Not only that, later on when I did study Lakota at the University of North Dakota, I found out that they spoke entirely in the female dialect. Lakota has a male and female dialect, and the person who taught them all their lines was a female, so it was all in a female dialect, even the men. So fast forward, I apologize for bouncing around a lot. I'm going to kind of go back and forth on my timelines here. As Native people, we're not very linear, right? We're very cyclical, so we kind of go back and forth. So I'm going to kind of do that. Oh, and before I go on any further, I wanted to apologize for my picture in the program there. I wasn't trying to dupe anybody to think that I look like that now. I don't take a lot of selfies, and that was the best one I could find at the time when they needed to submit a picture, so that's what they got. Okay, so fast forward, 1997. I go on to Haskell Indian Nations University in the town of Lawrence, Kansas. So natives from all over go there. You probably know people. Some of you may have already attended Haskell there. Christine talked about it yesterday, about it's still one of the active former boarding schools still around today. And they do have a lot of, so this is, anybody who's gone to Haskell knows what Tecumseh Hall is. This is the gym. This is where everybody goes to play ball. This is where the pool tables are and the food and all kinds of other stuff, the campus shop. Everybody meets at Tecumseh Hall. It wasn't until later that I actually learned who Tecumseh really was, you know, and the work that he did and how he almost made this really big comeback for our nation. He was like right there. I never knew how powerful Tecumseh was and the things that he did. To me, this was just Tecumseh Hall, the gym where we go play ball. So in 1997, I started going to school there, and all these students that came there, every now and then, at the beginning of class, the beginning of the year, different professors would go around the room and they would take attendance, and they would have all of the students, we want you to introduce yourself. Tell us your name, tell us your nation, tell us where you're from. So some people just introduced themselves in English, but you did have the occasional student who got up and in Dene said their whole name. They said all their clans, where they're from, and then somebody else might get up and introduce themselves in Lakota or a different language, and then somebody would get up and introduce themselves in a language again and translate for us. And it was really something to see those students get up and speak their language, even though it was just an introduction. I think once you figure out your introduction, it's kind of like this little thing that you can just do. It doesn't mean you speak the language, but at least you took effort to learn something. But it was really something to see all those students. And so as the thing's going around, right, so it's getting closer to me. Now I have to introduce, I'm like, oh, crap. I don't even know what to say. Like, I don't even know how to say, hey, how are you? I don't even know how to say, my name is. I didn't know how to say any of that. And there's part of me that felt ashamed of that. Like, how come I never learned how come they can introduce themselves and I can't introduce, I don't know the first thing about introducing myself, one bit. So there's this little bit of shame in there, but again, and then even then there was no resources. I couldn't call home and say, hey mom, how do I introduce myself? hey, Grandma, how do I introduce myself? There wasn't really anybody I could call. I didn't have tapes. I didn't have, but it was motivating to see, well, okay, I better figure it out then. I better find a way to figure it out. And actually, my former brother-in-law had Seneca tapes that he gave me, and that kind of helped get that going. So this is 2009. Well, this isn't particularly 2009, but this is the school we went to. So when I worked at Santa Fe Indian School, I worked with a teacher named Abby Arcaro from Cochiti Pueblo. And she had this cultural exchange program. We were going to take kids from Santa Fe Indian School up to the Six Nations Reserve in Ohsweken, Ontario. It's just, above and a little bit over to the west from Western New York. So up there you have all the Six Nations living there. That's a territory that was established later on after the Revolutionary War. There was a group of people that took our Confederacy and moved it over there. So they have this school called Gawanio, and it's an immersion school, and they teach Cayuga and Mohawk language. I think now they offer some Onondaga language as well. But there was a lot of times when I would meet people and I'd tell them, okay, I'm Seneca, I'm Turtle Clan. They're, well, what do you people do? Like, do you have songs? Do you have dances? Do you have ceremonies? And I couldn't answer that question. I couldn't tell them what we do. I didn't know. When I was little, my mom would occasionally take us out to the longhouse in Tonawanda, and the only thing I knew enough of was to just be quiet, be respectful while they were doing things. But I never knew why we were there. I never knew what was actually going on and what we were giving thanks for. So when people would ask me questions, I didn't have an answer for them. So in 2009, when we went to this school, there it was, like front and center. As soon as we got off the bus, they were greeting us with this speech, and they were giving us water, and they were dusting us off. And we went at just the right time because they were having all these different ceremonies during that time as well. So those kids that we brought, they all got to see these ceremonies that were going on in the springtime. They got to be in the longhouse to see the dances and hear the songs. And for me, it was really uplifting because to me, I was like, wow, it's still here. There's people still speaking the language. There's people still dancing. There's people still doing the ceremonies. And I saw all these little kids around the culture and around the language. And my little girls at that time were 5 and 2. And I thought, how come my girls can't be around something like this? I really wish I could raise my girls in something like this because they're still little. And to think even further, how come I didn't grow up in something like this? How come I didn't get to be around all this when I was younger? Not that I regret the path that I made, but that was the question for myself at the time. How come I didn't get to grow up around that stuff? So this school was really something. It lit this fire inside of me that said, I need to get back this way because I was down here in New Mexico. So that was a big start for me. So up there, they have this radio station called CKRZ. And back then, they had a streaming radio station. So every Wednesday night, they would play social songs. And when I was down here, I would fire it up and listen to social songs because I didn't have any CDs or anything like that. So that was my chance to listen to those social songs and hear our music. But one night, they decided not to play any music. And they played one of these elders just giving a lecture to a crowd. So his name was Jake Thomas Gount, and he was a Cayuga chief. And he used to be able to tell this story called The Great Law that takes a lot of days to tell. And he used to do it all by himself. And then in the afternoons, he would translate the whole thing too, all by himself. So he was on there, and I was listening. He had a lot of really good things to say. But one thing that really stuck out was when he said this line right here. He said, if you don't want your language and if you don't want your culture to continue, then that's where it'll stop, with you. And that stuck out to me so much. I got a piece of paper and I wrote it down and I taped it to my wall right there. That was kind of like a mission statement to me because I have 2 little girls now. I'm not just responsible for me, I'm responsible for them and their learning. And I want to give them more than I had when I was their age. And when I say I want to give them more than I had when I was their age, I'm not talking about Nikes and Levi's and all the best clothes and all the gadgets and stuff. I'm talking about those things that I saw at that Gowenio school. Those are the things I didn't have when I was younger. And when I heard that, I said, I want to give that to my daughters. I want them to have that. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't know where, but that's what I want to give them. And this statement from him really was another thing that stoked the fire. So this is my daughter, Gianna. This is her first day of school. So I'll kind of jump around on this a little bit. Every year when school starts, everybody likes to post the first day of school pictures. And everybody's so happy to go to school. And, you know, with our presenters this morning, they really kind of like pulled the blanket off as far as like the realities of our history that have happened over the years. And I think as we keep going further and further along in time, we keep getting further and further removed from the hardships that our ancestors faced. And it's not that we have to remember it and be down and out and be mad all the time, but we have to remember their struggle, because their struggle tells us what we're fighting for today to hang on to. So before school ever started, I started telling my daughter about these things, and Christine had this picture up yesterday. And then she kind of had this in the background here. So that's the first day of school for those boarding school kids. And they look pretty miserable, and rightfully so, because I don't think I have to go into it too much about the history of why they're there and what happened to them and why they're sitting in that spot right now at that time for their first day of school, and the thoughts that all of their parents and their aunts and uncles and grandparents thought about as their kids were plucked from their community and taken out to go into the education system. So I don't know if we should always take the first day of school as, hey, it's this great thing, because if you ask our ancestors back then, if you were to go into a time machine and bring a picture and say, guess what? In 150 years, our people are going to celebrate the first day of school. They're going to send their kids, they're going to buy new school clothes and new backpacks, and the kids are going to smile and they're going to go to school and they're going to learn this other system. And that system isn't for us. Because if you go and he talked about it today, he asked you, how many of you remember Native history in the books, right? And it was just this little section, right? So they wrote us out of their history. They wrote everything out. And we can go down the list of all the things that happened over the years. And all that was written out. And I know it was written out because I went to school too. I went to school through the public school system. It wasn't until I attended Haskell and took some American Indian Studies courses, and we went through the history of federal Indian policy. And they're going policy after policy after policy of, well, when this didn't work, they did this to us. And when that didn't work, they did this to us. And once they had us down to this, then they did this to us. And as I'm listening to the professor go through all these things, I'm getting angrier and angrier and angrier sitting in my class, because I was going, but I thought this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. I thought they said liberty and justice for all, and that all men are created equal. And didn't they say America is the greatest country in the world? How come I'm just hearing about all this stuff they did to our people? And it was like the blinders were just like ripped off. And I remember being so angry after that class. It was like this big lie. This big lie was perpetuated to us. And there's a power dynamic at play, because they had the power, right? We're the ones forced into the school now. We're the ones who've been whittled down to this little bit of people. You know, in 1900, we made up 0.03% of the population here. We didn't make up 0.5% of the population here. 0.03% of the population. Today, we make almost 2% of the population. So it's up, but we're still not even 2% of the population here. And there was a time when we made up 100% of the population, right? So something happened, but America wants to glorify it and tell you that, you know, everything was great, this all came. Even to speak to the point, you know, they have us sign up for their military at the highest rate per capita to go fight other brown people in their homelands. And I don't know, if you look at the history of the military, how many times can you actually look at the military and say that, oh yeah, they had our best interest? They didn't. They were the ones who, you're fighting these other people in their lands while they're over here sterilizing our women, forcing our kids into boarding school, outlawing our religions. That's not freedom. And I wanted my daughter to know that. I want her to know that background, because when I teach her language and when I take her to the longhouse, I want her to know why she's there. I want her to know what she has to hang on to, because we talk about people who refused to buy into that system and said, nope, I'm going to keep talking my language, I'm going to keep doing my culture, and they suffered for that. They paid a hard price to hang on to who they were, but they were thinking generations ahead, what's going to be left for the ones that come? And that's something we talk about, right? 7 generations. And we don't specifically say that in our language, 7 generations. We talk about the faces that are coming out of the ground. But we're thinking of these future generations of people that you're never going to meet. You're never going to meet that 7th generation, but they should be able to enjoy all the same things that you enjoy today, as far as your culture, your language, your ceremonies. They should be able to enjoy that. So what's your part in making sure that they enjoy that? You have to do that part. She has to do her part. I won't be here forever. I'll skip this one here. So, when we talk about the theme of the conference here, which is trauma and healing, I wanted to try to tie that in. So a few people, they noticed me when I sat at their table. Oh yeah, you're presenting. What's your topic? And it was kind of hard for me to articulate exactly what I'm going to talk about here. But we have these things in our culture. You have these things in your culture that have existed since time immemorial. We're human beings, right? So if you look at the names of the original names of your nations, a lot of them mean the people, the human beings, right? What does Dene mean? What does Absaluk mean? Right? So you're either the people, you're the principal people, you're the people of the canyon, you're the people of the first light. If you look at the names of our nations that we call ourselves, we're the people. So for us, we're Ongwe Onwe. Ongwe Onwe is like the real, original people. So in our culture, we have a lot of oratory. And I imagine some of you guys do too. But in our culture, there's so much oratory. They call them speeches. And I think that's a misinterpretation of what they are. They're these addresses, or they're there to acknowledge things. They acknowledge death. They acknowledge marriage. They acknowledge a new baby. There's these addresses that we have. And some of them are really extensive. So I'm going to talk later on about this Guyana's Hat Go. They've been having a recital of the Guyana's Hat Go for the past 6 years. They revived it. And every year they add another day on. So this past year, it took them 9 days to recite it. And it's a collaboration of all these speakers. So they speak all morning. They're telling the story all morning. And we break for lunch and they keep telling the story. So it's all in the language, and in that one, actually, there's people that translate after each passage. But even if you get the translation, you're missing out on some of it, because if those people that actually understand the language, they can tell the parts that the translator missed. The translator can't translate everything. So we have these extensive oratories. Right now, they're finishing up this oratory. They're on the day 3 of this big oratory called Gaiwio, or as they say out in his country, Galiwi. So that's a message that came post-contact about getting back to our roots. They're on the 3rd day of that today out there. There's a speaker who gets up and stands up and he talks for 3 hours straight. And he's holding these beads. And he's telling a story about how we're moving away from our ways and how that's affecting and all the behavior that it's causing us because we're adopting this new value system. And that guy sits up there and talks for 3 hours every morning. And when he's done, at the end of the week, everybody gets up and goes and shakes his hand that he took the time to learn that and tell that story. And you just hope that the people in the longhouse there have studied enough to understand the message that he delivered. So outside of that, like I said, addresses, speeches, life events. So I would ask you, how did your people address death, pre-contact? Because people died, right? People have been dying for generations, and we have to send them home. Your people had to send them home. So how did they address death? How did they address the grief that the people felt from the loss? What did they say? What are those words? Do you know those words? Have you heard those words? What are those words like? Because as I go home, that's what we study on Wednesday nights with my teacher. He just goes over speeches and just breaks them down. And as he breaks down these speeches, I can't help but just be amazed at, not only because these speeches are still here, but the psychology of our people to address these things that happen to us in life were already there. So when somebody passes, yeah, you have to mourn. We have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, they have to pull them back out to reality and say, okay, you have a life to live too. And I'll get to that. I got to see a marriage, traditional marriage out in Oneida, Wisconsin last year. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, is two people get married in a longhouse and promise all these things to each other and have somebody tell them what their responsibilities are to each other and to their family. And then to have a dance and have all these addresses entirely in the language to two of the most amazing people I know. They have speeches for when babies are born. They introduce them to all the creation. And they want them to be healthy. So what do you guys say when a baby's born? Do you say anything when a baby's born? Have you heard that before? So we'll go a little bit into the Gaianas Hatgowa. So that's what they call the Great Law, sometimes called the Great Law of Peace. So when we talk about healing and trauma, I can talk about my own healing and trauma as well. So if you look at my hands, I have rheumatoid arthritis. So in 2001, I got rheumatoid arthritis, and I was an athlete. I was a basketball player. I was relatively healthy. Anytime I got something, I just had to take a little medicine or whatever, and it would be gone. I'd be okay. But when I got this, it really threw me for a loop. And I didn't realize that I had something that I have to manage for the rest of my life. And there was a point in my life where it had crippled me so much that I could barely walk. I moved like I was 103 years old, and everything hurt. There was excruciating pain to do everything. And I mean everything. I had to will myself just to roll over in bed. I had to will myself just to sit up because it hurt so bad just to sit up. Everything hurt. And that pain became more than just physical pain. It became this spiritual pain, this mental pain. And there's times where I just wanted to just throw in the towel. And even though my parents didn't teach us the language and take us into culture, they did relay things to us about the culture. And one of the things they did always tell us, and I remember this when I was a little kid, they said, you can't commit suicide because if you kill yourself, you're not going to go to Galyatke. You're going to be stuck here. You're going to be stuck here the rest of your life. You have to live out your life the way it's supposed to be. So that played in my head a lot. I knew that if I did myself in, that I was going to be stuck here. So even though I'm in all this excruciating pain for months on end, I was praying for can you please just give me an hour of relief? Just an hour, just one day of relief, please. It was so hard. But I went to ceremony in Kansas, and that ceremony, they're real. It helped. I was able to move because of that. the kid's mom, I planned on growing old with her and living out our lives and raising our children, but that wasn't meant to be. So we separated in 2010, and that was a really tough time in my life. So in the story there, part of the story in the Guyana's Hatgowa is this guy named Hayowentap. He's a chief in that story, but there's a part in that story where somebody wants his daughters, and they keep rejecting the advances of this person, so this person puts bad medicine on him, and he kills the daughter. And so you have a parent experiencing the grief of losing a child. And then he moves on to the next daughter. That person wants the next daughter. She refuses his advances. So it goes on. He ends up killing all three of his daughters. The third one ends up dying because she gets trampled by some lacrosse players who are distracted. So he loses his wife and all his daughters. So he's in this state of grief. And he's in such a state of grief that he decides, I'm just going to walk the earth. I'm just going to walk the earth. I don't care what happens. I'm just going to walk the earth. And he gets to a point where there's a lake, and there's these birds on the lake, and they take off, and then symbolically they say they took the water up, and he finds these beads, and it catches his eye, and so he strings these beads together, and he begins to condole himself. So part of that word is he says, if anybody is ever in feeling the grief that I'm feeling right now, these are the words that I would say to them. And he condoles himself. So these are like the three sympathy strings. So I want to mention too that in 2013 there was this big meeting in Minnesota at the headwaters of the Mississippi. And one of the ladies is here that she was out there. It was really good to see her. I haven't seen her since then. They had this big meeting, so they were going to talk about these three sympathies. Well, actually, there's more than three. And this leader who's passed away now, Jake Swampgown, he had this idea, because we were talking about, are we ready? Are we ready for an apology? Right? Are we ready to move on? He understood that we've been going through this grief for hundreds of years, and that we need to dust off and kind of renew ourselves. So he called all these nations from the four directions, and a lot of people came to Minnesota at the headwaters, and we had this big ceremony. And they did these addresses. That guy didn't get to live to see it, but his daughters made sure it got carried out. So I'll talk a little bit about that with the language too. So one of the first things they address is the tears. So when you're going through this really hard time, you cry. You have tears in your eyes all the time. So that's what it'll say, like, "Ongas hago sadoon, tate sadayandats." You can't see clearly, right? Your vision is blurry. So if your vision is blurry, you're not seeing like all the beautiful things around you. You're in this, this haze. So what they'll say is, "Wainan yongud ungas hat." So they say like they wipe their finger through that. They wipe it through those tears to like clear it. And then they'll say, "En Jesus hats si wayandako." So it says you're going to remember your responsibility. So you have a responsibility to the people that are still here. You still have a responsibility to your children. You still have a responsibility to your siblings. You still have a responsibility to any of your relatives or the people that you care about. Even though we've experienced this loss, we're going to wipe those tears out, and now you're going to see all the stuff. You're going to start to see everything around you again. You're going to see all the beautiful flowers and the trees and the sun shining. You're going to see all these things again, because when you're in that grief, it's really tough. So this is one of the ways like they kind of like address the grief to help you. Right away, they start with the eyes. So the next thing is the ears. So if you've ever been in grief And it doesn't really matter, like if it's somebody dies or if just something really bad happens into your life. Something where you're just going, why me? Why is this happening to me? I think you've all been there at some point where something happens to you and it really just gets you down. Something hits you hard and flips your life over. And you wonder why it's happening to you. When's this ever going to end? You feel like it's never going to end. And so there's people around you trying to encourage you, saying it's going to be okay, we're here for you. You know, it's going to end. These things, all these things pass, right? But that grief is so stuffed in there. Those words that they're trying to say to you, they don't really reach you. They don't really like stick. They have all this, you've done it, you've talked to people that are in grief and they don't listen, right? They can't listen because that grief is packed in there. So that's what it said. O gayandat, de wasia soundgata, de satondet. That's what it's saying. That grief has landed and it's packed in there really tight and you can't hear the things around you. So we're addressing that. And same thing, so we said this before, why no nyon good? They remove that obstruction. So they're removing it, and they wasia, that thing that's blocking it, sound got taught. Your ears, they take that finger and they move it out of your ear. And then there it is. And also went and jisatonde scanotzi goditsta. So now, in a good way, you're going to start to be able to hear again. That goditsta is like chatter, but that's all the good words that people have for you. They're trying to lift you up your mind. And once they clear that obstruction of the grief, now those words can come in and they can help you feel better again. They can start to work on you to lift up your mind and help you move past that grief. And then in the esophagus too, right? So when you're really going through this tough time, what do you get? You get a lump in your throat, right? Sometimes maybe you don't want to cry, but you just have this lump in your throat. And it's really big. It feels like the biggest lump. It's hard to swallow. It's hard to talk. Your voice isn't strong. You're really down and out. So it's all the same stuff. They recognize that you have this lump in your throat, and they give you water, but they also, same thing, they remove that obstruction from your throat. So once they remove that obstruction again, in Jesus Hats, Siwayandahko, you're going to start to remember your responsibility again. Same thing to your family, to your children, to your grandchildren, to your nieces and your nephews. So this is just 3 of the strings. There's more that goes on. But this existed before contact. This is how our people addressed grief and sorrow and hardship. This is how they had to lift someone back up. And when you learn about this, you see that it's in your culture. It's not that education and research methods are meaningless, but the Creator gave all of our nations these things that we needed to survive in this world. They say He gave us everything we need. And He gave us these too, these instructions to address the things that we go through in life. So it doesn't matter whether you're from the Southwest or the Northwest or the Northeast or, in the Midwest. All your people had these things to address those hardships that come through in life. And it's up to you to find those. If you already know those, share those with the young people, because the young people are looking for things to fall back on. So if they don't have something like this to fall back onto, then they're going to turn to other things. They're going to turn to other outlets. And I always tell my daughter, when you go through your hard times, your ceremonies are your medicine. So even in her Dakota side, she can go to sweat. She can sing ceremony songs. She can sing healing songs and help songs and encouragement songs out that way. She can smudge off out there. Or we can talk about things like this. Those are the things that she can always fall back on for the rest of her life, when she's a teenager, when she's a young mom, when she becomes a grandma, because that grief, it'll hit you anytime in your life, right? But if you have these principles to fall back on, that's what's going to prop you, lift you back up again. Those are the things that you want to perpetuate to your people. How do we uplift our minds? How does your people uplift their minds when it comes to something like this? Because this is healing right here. And we've gone through nothing but trauma since they arrived in this hemisphere. So before I talk about this, I'll get into the Great Law a little more. There's this belief that in Native America, that this was just like utopian societies. We never fought, nothing bad ever happened until the white people came. But that's not the case. It's especially not the case where we live, because those original 5 nations, a long time ago, we were at war with one another. We had blood feuds with each other. We hated each other. No nation could ever get even with the other nation. So it's just a constant back and forth. So our people lived with what they call today PTSD. If you're out there in the woods and you're hunting for food and you hear a noise in the woods, that could be a party out ready to kill you right then and there. You didn't know, because that was the life back then. Kill or be killed. So everybody lived in fear, constant fear. But it took a man that came to us. So they call him the Peacemaker. And he had this message of this unrelenting message of peace, that the Creator gave us a mind to solve problems. So when I talked about those passages, those 3 things about the eyes and the ears and the throat, that was part of the process. So if you think of people in your communities, there's probably people you don't get along with, or there's people you know who they don't get along. We can't have them in the same room because they don't like each other, right? What does it take to move past that? Our people were in this really dark time, and the Guyana's Hatgowa is a testament to say that we came out of a time of darkness and dysfunction and bitterness and stubbornness. And there were people in that story who didn't want to change. And the Peacemaker and the people who rallied behind him never said, "Oh, that's just how they are. That's just the way they are. That just, it's not going to happen." There were 2 Seneca chiefs who really profited from plundering other nations. So when he put that first council together, that was their first task. You got to deal with these 2 Senecas. Well, they probably had enough people. If they wanted to, they could have just wiped those Senecas off the map. But that's not the choice they took. The choice they took was, we need them as much as we need everybody else. And a lot of these leaders that got put in, they weren't perfect people. They were people who committed really horrible things, but they turned their mind around. They started working for the peace. And it wasn't overnight. It took a long time. So how do we do that? How do you bring people together to confront their differences? Because that's the thing, is we got to have these difficult conversations. A lot of times we got to have these difficult conversations. So you have to address the traumas that happen. So we have to acknowledge, you killed my brother's whole family. Well, yeah, but you killed my sister's kids. That's how bad it was back then. So how do you get those people to come? And first thing we have to do is just acknowledge what was done first. You can't just put them together and say, "Hey, let's work this out." They don't even want to be in the same room yet. So first thing you have to do is dust them off, acknowledge you've had trauma, you've had injuries, we're rounding you out. You ever had an argument with your spouse or something, and they're like way up here and you're just at a calm? It doesn't work, right? There's no productive dialogue if one's here and one's here, or if we're both way up here. There's no productive dialogue. Nothing comes out of that. So that was a process of rounding people out first before we even bring them together. And then it's a process. It wasn't, let's have one meeting and everything will be done. We had to find things in common, move it forward. Maybe it would break down and we still had to be able to come back to the table. I will encourage you to read an article online called "The Warriors Who Turned to Peace." The Warriors Who Turned to Peace. It's just a short piece, but it kind of gives a little synopsis of what it was like back then. It's by a really good author, the late John Mohawk, The Warriors Who Turned to Peace. If you just type that in Google, you'll see it. So I'll just get briefly on this here. So more than a language, the more I learn, I'm not going to say that I'm this longhouse speaker than I do everything in the longhouse, but I am learning and I am getting more responsibilities in the longhouse. As I learn, I try to show my teacher that I'm actively trying to participate and advance myself to be one of those people that carries it on. So it does become a responsibility, because once somebody knows you can do a wake, once somebody knows you can do a funeral, once somebody knows you can do the opening address, you might be sitting there in a longhouse just trying to hang out and watch everybody dance, and you see the footsteps starts coming towards you. You know they're going to ask you to do something. So it becomes a responsibility. And for us, like, we don't have a lot of speakers at home, so if you're one of the three or one of the four and the other three are gone, guess who has to do it? You got to do it. So when we talk about priorities, I'll move on to what is success, because we talked about that today. Western education does have its merits. I wouldn't be where I am without going to college and getting a degree. But I think we have to think about how much we're forcing education on our kids, because we take this Western education and it's a requirement for them, right? They have to go to school. They have to do good in their grades. If they're slipping in English or algebra, well, we got to have a sit down and talk. You're slipping up in class. Not acceptable in this house. But do we have the same priority when it comes to our language and our culture? Do you ever go to your kids and say, are you ever going to be able to help out in the ceremonies? Can you help out? These old guys aren't going to be here forever. Who's going to open up next? Who's going to run this ceremony? And the numbers don't lie. Our languages, we're losing one language every 14 days to 17 days. They talk about, in what they're talking about this week, he talks about these three groups. So the really big group, then there's one that's half the size, and then there's one that's just a few people. So he said that biggest group is going to be the ones that don't believe anymore. They don't believe in our ways. And then the middle group is going to be like the people that kind of half believe and kind of do believe our ways. And the smallest little group is going to be the ones that's really holding on in our communities. And I don't know if it's like that in your communities or not, or you can say there's just a small group of people that are the ones that are really holding on and passing on the things that really matter, that make us who we are. Because we talk about survival, and of course we're going to survive. We are going to survive into the future. But what's going to survive into the future with us? Because if everybody in our nations has a PhD and a master's and has this great job, but nobody can run the ceremonies, nobody can sing the songs, nobody can speak the languages anymore, then can we say we've succeeded? Everybody is so worried about being the next person to make it in the WNBA, or the next person to be the first PhD in their family, instead of being the next person that helps lead our nation with our ceremonies. That's priorities. And again, I say that not to diminish the hard work it takes. I have friends who pursued PhDs. They were working 24/7 to do that and raising a family. But you have to ask yourself where those priorities are, and what do you want for the future of your nation, and where are you going to put those priorities? I don't have time to tell this story. Maybe I can talk about this in the breakout session. So in our language, we have this phrase, jago. So that means don't give up. Jago is a very catch-all phrase. It means all kinds of things. It means keep up the good work. It means good job. It means try your hardest. It's a word of encouragement. So I'm going to end with that there. I hope you were able to get something out of that. I did the best I could. I made my mistakes. But I'll end it there because I think everybody's hungry and we're ready to go get something to eat. So, Daneho.